Ethan Carter was only 30 years old, but life had already taught him lessons most men twice his age hadn't learned. He had grown up in a small town, fixing broken-down trucks and rusted tractors, always covered in grease, yet always with a quiet determination in his eyes. His hands were rough, his clothes old, but his skills were unmatched. He could hear an engine sputter and know exactly what was wrong. Still, no one in the city's corporate world ever took a small-town mechanic seriously. That would change. On one fateful day, inside a massive manufacturing plant in Chicago, the Hale Industries factory was buzzing with tension. Workers whispered in worried tones. Engineers argued over diagrams, and supervisors paced nervously along the aisles. At the center of the chaos stood a massive production machine, state-of-the-art, imported from Germany, and completely dead. For weeks, the machine had refused to start, despite the best efforts of the company's highly paid technicians. Every hour it sat silent. The company lost thousands of dollars. The factory had already fallen behind on its contracts, and rumors of layoffs spread like wildfire among the workers. Hope was nearly gone. When Ethan walked in, wearing his faded denim jacket and carrying a small toolbox, heads turned. Some laughed under their breath. He didn't look like the kind of man who belonged in such a gleaming factory filled with computer screens and flashing monitors. Richard Hale, the CEO himself, came down from his glass-walled office to see what the fuss was about. At 52, Richard was a tall man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. He was known for being ruthless with employees and dismissive of anyone he thought beneath him. To him, Ethan looked like a nobody. With a mocking smile, Richard walked up to the mechanic and said loudly enough for the entire floor to hear, "So this is our miracle worker. You're just a small-town grease monkey, aren't you? Tell you, what, if you can fix this beast, I'll make you my partner." The engineers laughed, smirks spreading across their faces. They thought the comment was a joke, another cruel jab from their boss. But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. He simply adjusted his jacket, put his toolbox on the ground and said calmly, "Let me try." Something in his tone silenced the laughter. The hours that followed were like something out of a movie. Ethan crawled under the machine, studied its wiring, listened to the faint clicks of gears, and traced every connection with careful precision. Where others saw a mess of wires, Ethan saw a pattern. He tapped pipes with a wrench, adjusted belts, and even rewired a circuit by hand. Workers gathered around, whispering as he worked. The engineers, though skeptical, couldn't help but notice the confidence with which he moved. He didn't guess, he knew. His hands worked with the rhythm of a man who had spent his whole life breathing life into dead machines. By nightfall, Ethan was still at it, sweat dripping down his forehead, grease covering his arms. Richard Hale stood watching from a distance, his smirk slowly fading as he realized the young mechanic was not wasting time. He was making progress. Midnight approached, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sound, a low hum. Sparks flickered, gears shifted, and suddenly the massive machine roared back to life. Lights glowed across the factory floor as the machine's conveyor belts began to move, steady and strong. The silence that followed was shattered by cheers erupting from every corner of the factory. Ethan stood up, exhausted but calm, wiping his hands on a rag. The workers applauded him like a hero, shouting his name. The engineers, who had once mocked him, now stared in disbelief. Richard Hale, usually quick with sharp words, found himself speechless. For the first time in years, the ruthless CEO had no sarcasm left. He looked at Ethan with a mix of shock and respect, realizing that this grease monkey had done what his entire team of professionals could not. That night, everything began to change. The factory floor buzzed with life the next morning. Workers came in early, still talking about the miracle they had witnessed the night before. For weeks they had been told there was no hope, that the machine was too advanced to repair, and yet a single mechanic with a simple toolbox had proved them all wrong. Ethan arrived quietly, head down, trying to avoid the attention. He wasn't there for glory, but everywhere he turned, workers clapped him on the shoulder, thanking him for saving their jobs. For them, his skill meant food on the table and hope for tomorrow. Up in his office, Richard Hale sat brooding. He had slept little, the sound of the machine's steady hum still echoing in his mind. He had made a joke in arrogance. "I'll make you my partner." But the mechanic had called his bluff and delivered the impossible. For the first time in years, Richard felt humbled. His pride fought against his reason. Part of him wanted to dismiss Ethan, to brush it off as luck. But another part, the sharper, colder businessman inside him, recognized that what Ethan had done was genius, and genius could not be ignored. Later that morning, Richard summoned Ethan to his office. Ethan entered, still in his faded jacket, toolbox in hand, his posture calm but guarded. Richard stood at the window, watching the city skyline before. Turning to face him, "You embarrassed my engineers," Richard began slowly, his tone unreadable. "You fixed something no one else could fix. Do you know what that means?" Ethan's voice was steady. "It means your factory is running again, and your people still have their jobs." The blunt honesty caught Richard off guard. It wasn't the answer of a man seeking favors. For the first time, Richard studied him not as a mechanic, but as a man. He saw the determination in Ethan's eyes, the humility in his stance, and something more, a strength that couldn't be bought. The CEO paced the room, finally saying, "Last night I made a promise. It was meant as a joke, but you forced me to reconsider. You don't just fix machines, you solve problems others can't." Ethan remained quiet, unsure where this was heading. Richard extended his hand, the weight of his decision heavy in the air. "Welcome to Hale Industries, partner." The word echoed like thunder. The announcement spread quickly across the factory floor. Workers couldn't believe it. The young mechanic, who had walked in as an outsider just a day before, was now standing as a partner in one of the city's most powerful companies. Some engineers bristled with jealousy, while others nodded in quiet respect, admitting the man had earned it. Ethan, however, didn't bask in the praise. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. To him, partnership wasn't about wealth or titles. It was about proving that skill, honesty, and determination could break through walls of arrogance and doubt. That evening, Ethan returned to his small apartment on the edge of the city. His hands were still sore, his clothes still stained with grease, but his heart carried a quiet pride. He thought of his late father, who had taught him that a man's worth wasn't in money or status, but in what he could build with his hands. Ethan smiled faintly, realizing that lesson had carried him here. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a partner, a leader, and perhaps even a symbol for every worker who had been underestimated in silence. The factory roared on in the days that followed, stronger than ever. Ethan walked the floor not as an outsider, but as one of them, earning trust through actions rather than words. Richard, still sharp and demanding, found himself relying more and more on the young man's insight. Though their worlds had been different, a strange partnership formed between the ruthless CEO and the humble mechanic, one built not on jokes or power, but on respect. And for Ethan, it was the beginning of a future far greater than he had ever dared to dream.